Good evening, everybody. Welcome back for the next webinar in the Drew Teach series, The Ethics of Digital Literacy. Tonight, we are excited to host P.L. Thomas from Furman University, who's going to be talking with us about satire in the era of fake news. Paul, thank you for joining us. If there's anything else you'd like to share about your background, that would be wonderful. I'm going to turn this over to you now. Just make sure you unmute yourself.
There we go. Sorry. Y'all can hear me? We're all good? Good. Hi, I'm Paul Thomas. Yes, just a little background. I was a high school English teacher for 18 years, rural South Carolina. And then the most recent, another 18 years, I've been a teacher educator at Furman. And I also teach first year writing. And some of the background for this particular chapter and what I'll be talking about tonight is I co-edited a book on fake news, post-truth, and digital literacy with Chris Gehring. And since then, this chapter really gave me an opportunity to start thinking about if I were teaching English again, how I would approach that a lot differently in that context. So basically the idea that I came up with was how I would approach satire a lot differently. And that's pretty much what I'm going to talk about tonight. And so the first thing, you can probably skip through till about the fourth slide, the one that says the ethical dilemma of satire. Is that, you know, traditionally, I believe we taught satire sort of literature based, and sort of the canon of what works were sort of seminal works in satire. And then I know as an AP teacher, I taught AP Lit for a long time. A lot of what we did in AP Lit was to focus on satire in canonical text. And I always thought that was one of the sort of the tricks of AP Lit, was what students could read a passage and understand that the language wasn't literal, but it was satirical, and that sort of traditional characters and traditional ideologies were being satirized and not being reinforced, which was very difficult for conservative Southern kids in rural South Carolina. That was a really a big challenge for them. So if you go to the next slide, and that's sort of where I was talking about, you know, tone and how we approach satire. And again, I think we thought of it more literature based. And I definitely think that if I were teaching English specifically, it would shift a lot more to focusing on satire in the context of teaching students to read and to read critically, but also it would be part of the writing curriculum. But the reading critically, I think, is a lot different than teaching about literature. And I especially think it's a lot different than teaching students how to analyze literature in sort of traditional ways that we find in, again, like the AP test. So the next slide, key concepts. So I do want to give some sort of groundwork. And the first term that I think is really important to understand is fake news. Interesting, just recently I had an exchange with a journalist that accused me of using the term fake news sort of the way that Trump uses it, just to discount anything that he doesn't agree with. And I think that's very interesting, because we were having a pretty serious conversation about a topic. And that's one thing that really concerns me, is that most people don't have a good context of fake news is a pretty technical term. And for a while, it was a process of posting online literally fake stories that were designed to create traffic. It was just clickbait. And these fake stories would run their course of creating traffic for people to make money off of ads, and then they would just disappear. And that's a lot different than talking about like shoddy journalism. And I do think that's a real important distinction to make. I'm not sure that there's any reason to try to make sure that people use the term correctly, but fake news had a very specific technical term that I think kind of passed by, that people didn't understand or didn't even know about that, because it's used in kind of the general discourse to mean that you just discount something for being inaccurate. And a lot of times it's simply because you don't agree with it. By contrast, I think it's important to understand, especially for students, this seems like a really difficult distinction. Satire is also purposefully untrue. But the difference, I think, is fake news is hoping that the audience doesn't understand that. Satire is more an agreement that the writer is assuming that the audience will understand that this is misinformation for a purpose, and it's to make a bigger point. And what's interesting about this to me is, particularly compared to when I was teaching, satire is much more prevalent and easily accessible on the internet with things like The Onion and McSweeney's. And particularly McSweeney's is a pretty high level of literary satire. The other terms that I think are important to understand is sort of the term post-truth, and it comes out of postmodernism, but I think it's really important to make a distinction. Postmodernism really was an important point in sort of the left interrogating what counts as truth and who decides what is true. Post-truth, I think, is a better description of what has happened outside of the realm of academics. I think postmodernism was kind of within the academy and was within disciplines, but post-truth has moved into how that looks in the popular world, and it's become much more cynical in the sense of, instead of saying, I think postmodernism is more saying that whoever has power has control over determining what counts as true, which is not quite the same as in popular discourse now. There is no truth, or I'm saying what is true and others don't count because they're simply not me. Some of that has to do with power, and a lot of, especially for Trump, that is in his position as president, that is a huge aspect of it, the power. And then a final thing I touched on a minute ago is how journalism and sort of public nonfiction fits into all of this. All right, we switched. I'm seeing the screens now, so I don't know if that's what I was supposed to do.
Yeah, we're good. I'm sorry. I was having trouble getting my computer to share, so it just took a while. So now you can see your slides.
Great, excellent. So we can go to the next slide if you want to. So the example that I'd like to share is, I think this is pretty fascinating, that out of the New York Times, there was an article on people that were on public assistance and using what we popularly call food stamps. And as you can see from the headline, in shopping cart of a food stamp household, lots of soda. And I do think it's important to understand that despite sort of the discounting of the New York Times as a leftist publication, the New York Times carries a great deal of clout and is still considered sort of the pinnacle of mainstream media. And what's important about this story is it's very difficult to distinguish that New York Times article from Woman, a leading authority on what shouldn't be in poor people's grocery carts. And that's a satirical piece in The Onion. And if you look at the two pieces, and they're pretty easy to Google and find them, they're very similar in sort of the way they catalog and the kind of not so hidden assumptions that are made about people. What's really important, I think, to connect also is if you look at the third article, not long after the New York Times article, you see that there's actual public policy that is following the mainstream journalism making a claim about how people who are on public assistance use that money. So to give that context, if you go down further, the USDA and an article in the Jacobin point out that the vast majority of the information in the New York Times article is not true. And I think this is really important for students to understand. That doesn't mean that it's fake news. It is what I mentioned before, it's shoddy journalism. It is a journalist who is not being critical of his own assumptions about people in poverty and making these sort of claims out of his authority as simply being a journalist for the New York Times. The person, Joe Soss, who's writing in the Jacobin, actually is an authority on the topic, and the USDA report is actual data on the topic. So I show this as sort of a potential new kind of text set that we might do in the English classroom when we're trying to talk about, you know, the ethical dimensions of critical literacy, critical digital literacy, and how that is much different than the kind of text set. That's much different than the kind of text set that I would have put together when I was teaching AP English almost 20 years ago. That's the main thrust of what I have prepared. I'm assuming we can have some discussion now if anybody would like to. That essentially is the kind of text set that I see that we should be moving toward if our concern is with a different approach to literacy.
Okay, so I know Vanessa doesn't have a microphone, so she's asking a question, Paul. Yes, but journalism isn't writing. That is, in theory, it's about reporting info, not examining one's position in relation to info. Has that changed?
No, I think that's the problem. I interact with a lot of journalists, and I've literally had some direct interaction with journalists when I bring up this point, and they say it's not their job to investigate whether or not their claims are credible or the things they're reporting on are credible. And I find that really problematic. And I do think that's their job. And I do think it's, I mean, in this case, the article in the New York Times, there was a very tepid follow-up pointing out that there was a lot of factual inaccuracy. So I think at the very least, you can, and the problem was that this article misrepresents that USDA report. And that's the problem, is that these are that there's two levels. There's actual factual information that's wrong, but also when journalists report things as objective and they're actually ideological and they're their biases that they're unable to have any critical investigation of, there's the problem. So I do think we need a different standard for what counts as journalism. And almost always the argument that I get from journalists is, it's just my job to report this. It's not my job to sort of interrogate it. I think that's wrong. I definitely think that's a problem.
Sean, do you want to dig into your question or your comment, I guess, about clickbait?
Sure. Yeah. For me, it seems that a lot of people don't even go as far as reading the whole article, or they read the byline and a header, and then pull out the information that they want, or especially if it's something that they already agree upon. So that's disconcerting. And your comments about the reporter not feeling like they have to go further than just reporting the numbers really is actually very disheartening.
Yes, and I've literally had pretty hard pushback from them. So I think your initial point, I think one thing we need to look at is how do we create a set of strategies for our students when they do look at material online. So, because I think the normal thing for people to do, there's research, I don't have it right at the tip of my fingers, but there's research on that people far and above disproportionately share on social media by only looking at the headline, and they don't read the piece and they simply share. So I do think there's sort of a, it's too easy to work quickly through things on the internet. And I think it is too easy to work quickly through just headlines and maybe the beginning of the piece and not really look through. I'll also say that it's really interesting to me that most journalists will defend themselves with the both sides argument and say that they include both sides in their articles. And there's two problems with that. A lot of topics don't have both sides, or they have 10 sides. And then it's very hard to get through to many journalists that the order of the information, how you frame the information, sends a signal. So one of the topics that I have a lot of trouble with is grit, and Angela Duckworth's work on grit. And I'll see articles all the time that will start with a couple of paragraphs about all of her accomplishments. So she's framed as this highly accomplished expert. She's a professor. She's won awards. Sometimes they'll even put the amount of the award, which is, you know, impressive. And then they'll give her position on grit. And somewhere later in the article, anyone who disagrees with her will just be presented as, some people disagree, or critics say. They don't even get named. And they're sort of lumped together as just critics. And to me, it's very clear by the way the article is written that one of those positions is being prioritized over the other, even though the argument is I'm giving both sides. And I think these are things that, you know, again, it's strategies that we can give our students to look at things like how the two positions or how positions are presented. Are people's names given? Are their credentials given? Does that bias the reader? And so these are strategies that I think, these are kind of new strategies. This isn't the same as having students look for similes and metaphors and, you know, figurative language and trying to figure out the theme or the tone of a piece of fiction.
I thought in the reading it was really interesting that they talk about the both sides problem, and as if they give the same weight regardless of whether or not they are even remotely scientifically correct or the data proves them. I think in the chapter we talked about climate change as one of those things. So I was wondering if it seems to me that there's probably a fair amount of that. I'm just wondering what other topics we could be looking at where they're doing both sides, but we need to be really paying attention to that. Really, there isn't both sides here. There's one side, and there may be some offshoots of that, but there's not two competing sides necessarily.
Right. I don't know if people are aware, but there's a great episode. John Oliver does an episode where he interrogates that idea, and he says that they'll have one scientist who is for climate change and one scientist who is against, and that grossly misrepresents the proportion. So I think he does something silly, like he has one anti-climate change scientist come on stage and like 400 for. So you get the sense on stage that this is not a balance. It's not one against one. The example I use in education is that when we cover the Holocaust in a history class, we typically may mention Holocaust deniers, but we certainly don't give them equal weight. And I think that is a good example of one side is overwhelming. One side is, and it's an ethical reason that we do that. And then two things that I talk about in the public discourse a lot about education is corporal punishment and grade retention. The research base on both of those are overwhelmingly against corporal punishment and overwhelmingly against grade retention. And there's really not a both sides to that. There are people who endorse those practices, but there's not research that supports that those practices are either effective or appropriate. And for example, I was asked to be on a panel about corporal punishment, and the person arranging it even admitted behind the scenes they were having almost no luck finding someone who would speak pro corporal punishment. But they weren't going to have the panel without that. They insisted, and my point was they could have 3 or 4 people who were expert in the topic, and they would have some nuance to what they said. But I thought it was inappropriate to have both sides on that. And again, since this is about ethics, I thought it was unethical.
So we have some questions in the back channel, Paul, and I'm gonna actually break this question down before you answer. I want to ask a question of the people participating here. So the question in the Q&A document was, it seems today that we know to question sources on the internet. You regularly see commenters giving links to other info, criticizing the info provided or lack thereof, or on race lines, etc. What is counted as a credible news source today? So Paul, we're going to come back to you in a minute to think about what is counted as a credible news source today, but I'm curious about everybody else participating here. Do you see people giving links to other info, criticizing the info provided or lack thereof? Do you see that in the spaces where you are reading and interacting?
I don't feel like I normally do. Like, I feel like when I'm looking at material, because on the internet, because a lot of the news I consume is online, a lot of people feel that they have a right to say whatever they want with no resources. And the issue with that is that I've also seen people post resources that when you go to it, it is to news that is incorrect. So I find that I'm finding more of information that's been like misrepresented from people trying to prove a point and being like, yes, here's my source, if they choose to put one at all. Or if you ask, and then being like, oh, that's not how that was intended to be interpreted. And it's kind of like Sean was saying earlier, where it's more someone read the first 2 sentences under the title that were in bigger text. Because I find that people aren't as interested in offering things that are maybe as rooted in fact as they are in things that are rooted in emotional intensity, because they feel that'll make their point better.
Thanks, Julia. Other thoughts? I wonder about Paul's definitions of fake news, satire, and post-truth often as I'm scrolling through feeds and seeing what people are posting, but also how people are reposting. And Paul, you said earlier that, or Sean, maybe you said it, the reposting happens often on the titles without actually reading. So this idea of actually reading and thinking about what a credible source is a really important one. So I'm going to ask you, Paul, the second part of this question: what is counted as a credible news source today?
Well, I think it's really interesting. One phenomenon that I've noticed, and it seems relatively recent. There's more and more publications that identify things as long form, and they kind of warn you. And I think long form journalism, I think, is better. And I think there's a better chance of it being accurate. And I'm often find it to be quite good. For a specific source, The Conversation, which is entirely written by university-based scholars, is probably one of the best sources of news out there. Of course, since it's written by university-based scholars, it's probably slow compared to today's expectations of the media, but it's written for a general public. They're written pretty well. They are heavily hyperlinked, which I find to be that's a good sign to me. I have trouble. I do a lot of public work, and there's still a number of online publications that don't include the hyperlinks. And as an academic, as a scholar, it makes me really uncomfortable. I like to have my readers investigate and check what I'm saying. So I like to have that evidence in there. I'd say the conversation is one of the better ones. I'm not very happy with the New York Times. Routinely, it's quite bad in the ways of the example that I gave. They're just really kind of trapped in a set of ideologies, even when their facts are okay. I tend to find the Washington Post to be better as sort of a traditional paper. I don't know why that is. It's certainly not flawless, but it's better, I think. And I find publications like The Atlantic tends to give people more time and space. And I think magazines are a little slower, and I think people do a little more research, but they are online, and some of their work is online a lot quicker. Those would be the conversation. If people don't know it, it's worth checking out. I do think it's one of the better examples of what we could be doing.
So I'd like to kind of shift from what we've been talking about in terms of what the news is doing to thinking about the students in our classroom. So I know that we have teachers of kindergarten on this call, and we have teachers of graduate students on this call, and that's a broad array of knowledge and skills that we might need to start imparting with our students. So Paul, do you have any thoughts on where we start with teaching our youth and our current college and graduate students to recognize these differences between fake news and satire and post-truth, and how we might go about doing that?
Yes, and I do think I know people. I'm mostly a secondary and college level literacy person, but I also teach graduate courses in early literacy, and then a lot of my friends and colleagues are early literacy people. I do think that we can start immediately. I think kindergarten, first, second, third grade. And I think that age children are pretty fascinating, that they have a pretty good grasp on things that are made up and things that are real. And I think that's where we're really kind of starting with. And I think that's often not as easy a distinction as I think we want to believe. And I do think it's pretty fascinating how much of early literacy is spent in fiction, which I do think is pretty fascinating to me. And I often, as a writing teacher, I've always had problems with that we ask, very small children to write fiction. And it seems like a really huge ask, because asking high school and college age people to write quality fiction is pretty challenging and doesn't happen very often. I mean, doing it well. So I do think things like what counts as real, what counts as made up. And I do think might seem like a trivial distinction, but I always talk to students about trying to stay away from talking about true and not true, and talk more about created and made up with fiction, because we're still dealing with truths. And from fiction, the characters are made up, but what we know about the world is accurate, and it fits the world and the way we see the world. Definitely by the time students are in middle school and high school, and especially in college, I don't think this is really popular, probably because it was kind of poisoned by Common Core, but I'm a strong advocate for nonfiction. I'm a poet. I just worked on a poem before we started this tonight. And so I'm reading frantically novels constantly. I love fiction. I love poetry. But I do think traditionally we have kind of shorted nonfiction and how complex it is and how many different kinds of nonfiction there are. So with my first year writing students, we read a tremendous amount, or I give them opportunities to read a tremendous amount of essays. And I would say if I were teaching high school again, and while I'm teaching first year students, I focus a lot on sort of genre and form. What makes something an essay, and then what does that mean? And it's working within the realm of what do we call nonfiction. One thing I learned, I think, a long time ago is I try to make these assignments more questions than giving them prescriptions. So when I taught poetry, the poetry unit was what makes a poem a poem. When my first year students are working on essays, we're constantly asking, what makes this an essay? What makes this personal narrative? What makes this an argument? So I think investigating and asking these questions, approaching these topics as questions is an important strategy.
Thoughts from some of our teachers in the room?
I find one of the things that happens a lot in my classroom is that students sometimes misunderstand not even comedy so much as straight up bullying as irony or satire. So like I always think of South Park, where they will like walk around quoting things that are downright cruel and they're like, haha, it's just satire, you don't understand. And I always have trouble trying to explain the difference to them that that is not satire because your audience isn't on the in like you are. And it's always a very difficult thing to play with.
Well, I think that's a really good point, is just talking about, again, making distinctions. And I think sometimes academics are prone to being too focused on definitions, but I think this is a healthy thing for our students, making a distinction between satire and what counts as funny, what is a joke, is it at someone's expense? And I think that gets into the moral and ethical part of it. Even satire, if it's cruel, that's a different kind of satire than satire that has some sort of altruistic goal. And again, I would say something like, you see a lot of, again, there's a lot of things online. I think John Oliver is a good example. He can be profane, it can be harsh, and I think overwhelmingly you can almost always make the argument that he has a higher goal that has ethical and moral elements to it. Something like South Park, I'm not sure you can always make that case, although I think there are times it's much more complicated, and it's not pure. I think there are times that some other types of satire and so-called comedy have elements that are, have ethical ends and moral ends, and then there's others that certainly are at someone's expense. And I think that's a good thing. Again, it's about giving students strategies. And the students who don't get it, I think it's not that they're not capable. They haven't been given the opportunity or been made aware of doing that sort of work. And I guess maybe for many people, I think if it feels like work, that kind of detracts from pop culture.
So I am a theater teacher, and I also coach on this, don't coach, but I help with coaching some of my speech students. And one of the ways that I found to get students more involved with nonfiction is to have them do a declamation before we move into doing monologues, because they are based, for anyone who doesn't know, DEC is a category for just 9th and 10th graders, but we do it at any age at Summit for classwork. And you take a speech that's already been performed, and then you memorize it, you perform it, but you memorize it, you perform it for the class, but you also do an intro where you explain why it's relevant still and what like it connects to you and everything like that. And I really think that helps also, though, because if you read any good acting book, it's all about being honest and truth and authentic. Or like my favorite textbook is called Truth and Comedy, because we do a lot of improv. And like Jesse kind of said, when kids get nervous, they immediately go to, no, I don't want to do this. No, you're wrong. We're doing this thing. We're like kind of getting like down and trying to run the scene so they don't act as nice to each other. And doing the decks and seeing like, oh, there's truth in this, there's honesty, I need to find a truth for me and a relevance. And then they bring that to like, oh, my improv, I'm going to be truthful and honest and positive and building from it, is really like how I've been able to kind of incorporate, oh, let's not just focus on you know, some great plays. And obviously I love plays and I love storytelling, but let's find the truth and the honesty in everything so that it can be like a nonfiction for the audience.
Yeah, I think that's just a different way of thinking about interacting with text. I think especially at the K-12 level, we've spent way too much time doing sort of literary analysis, where you're just looking at like technique and rhetorical strategies and it's sort of, to me, I've never liked this. I always it felt like algebra. You just add up all the techniques and you get some sort of meaning. I think what you're talking about is sort of more like an iceberg, that there's a lot beneath the surface that isn't explicit, but it's important. And I think that also goes to the point a minute ago about students watching something like South Park. And what I would say is, connected with what you just said, it feels like if you're watching South Park and just giggling at cruel things, you're watching at a surface level. You're not watching it deeply. And I think we want students well educated. I tell my students go to an expensive university, and I tell them, someone is spending a lot of money for you to be here. You want to leave this university interacting with the world in a much different way than you were before you came here. If that makes you work a little harder when you're interacting with pop culture, I think that's great. And it is going beneath the surface for things that matter. And it's not just analyzing technique, which I think is when we have people watch, not act out, but we have people watch or read plays, we're really doing a disservice to plays. I mean, plays weren't designed to be critically analyzed for their literary technique. And I think that's that's sort of missing what we're supposed to be doing. And I think it's the same thing that happens once they make the transition. Most people leave school and interact most of the time with nonfiction, and they don't have the skills because they've been doing what I think are sort of not really very useful things with text, the literary analysis, that is.
Paul, I'm wondering how to teach satire. I think that, that's kind of at the crux of this, like that there is a legitimate form of humor and literary expression that rests in satire. And in this world where satire is seen as real news or fake news, or we can't understand that it's satire, how can we just focus on the satire perhaps in our classrooms?
Right. And I do think, and I also, early on in my teaching at the high school level, it hit me that recognition of satire is kind of a brain development or IQ test. So part of me got very worried about, can you teach people to be sensitive to this? I think you can. One thing, the strategy that I found effective when I was teaching high school is film. We watched Monty Python. We watched Raising Arizona. We talked about Raising Arizona as a text and as a purposeful text. We didn't do literary analysis with it. We talked about it as purposeful text. What are they doing on purpose to position you, and how are you supposed to respond to it? And I found it was very telling. Students would watch scenes from Monty Python, and you would get kids who could not stop themselves from laughing, and other kids who would respond, "That was stupid." And the students who were saying that was stupid were looking at it at the surface level and did not recognize it as satire. Then you have to also leave the option that at some point, I think everybody has the option of some things aren't funny to some people. And I think that's different. You can recognize something as satirical and not find it necessarily provoking laughter, and you can still say that's not funny. Saying that's not funny to me is different than my students would literally say that's stupid. And it's because they couldn't see the sort of the craft of it, the intent of it. I also think I was lucky. I was teaching mostly in the 80s and 90s, and there was still sort of a heyday of Saturday Night Live. I taught when there were shows like In Living Color. I think having those pop culture references were very effective. I think there's less of that. I think there's kind of been a resurgence of Saturday Night Live. I've noticed students who engage with that and are sort of aware of the sometimes crude and not very complex, but that's what satire is. I had a lot more success with doing film to help them understand satire. And some of those students who got it in film still really struggled with Dickens. There's a lot of satire in Dickens. The language is so difficult for students that they often couldn't get past that.
Vanessa's asking how Saturday Night Live is satire and not just comedy.
Well, satire to me has the element of that it takes something real and exaggerates the qualities to draw our attention to something larger than the thing itself. So parody and satire to me are, somebody said can be both. Yes, I think it is both. So, and I think it's that when you see somebody parodying actual political figures that are in office now, it is a satire of the entire political system. It is a satire of how leadership is in the United States. And I think that's the distinction that you have to make.
I'm thinking of satire through political cartoons, which happens often, I think, in the social studies classroom. And I know we have a few social studies teachers, but we also have elementary teachers that might introduce satire through that visual image, which may be a little bit more like the film aspect that you were saying. But this also brings up another question that has been asked about yellow journalism and whether yellow journalism is the same as fake news. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I certainly could see that there is sort of a lineage. To me, fake news is grounded very heavily in the internet-based existence. So I think that to me would be slightly different. Yellow journalism, I think, still has an aspect of journalism to it. Fake news is purely to generate clicks to make money. So it's more a mechanism for a kind of profiting. Journalism is certainly to make money also, but I would say there's some slight differences. I would say a lineage, yes, but I don't think they're the same thing.
Are there any other questions? Paul, you have any last thoughts on this era that we're living in and what we should be doing as teachers?
Yeah, I think the big scope of this is if we move away from how we teach our students to what our job is as teachers. I do think we're at a very important point to rethink our roles as political agents. And one thing that I try to emphasize to people who are becoming teachers and people who are currently teachers is being a teacher by necessity is political. And I think, again, to define terms, we often confuse that with partisanship. And when people say that teachers shouldn't be political, I think what they really mean is teachers shouldn't be partisan. So I do agree, although it's difficult, I do agree that we should not stand in front of a class of students and tell them who to vote for. But just simply being neutral on everything is a political act. And if we don't make sort of ethical and moral stands with and for our students, then we are passively endorsing the status quo. And even recently, I've thought very seriously about what is our responsibility at the high school, seniors in high school, and at the college level when we have students who are old enough to vote. More and more people are saying we have a responsibility to encourage college age and people 18 and over, students, to vote and to be well informed. I certainly think that would make a lot of people uncomfortable. I'm not completely sure. I'm certain I want students to be informed. I don't know if it's crossing a line to, to encourage them to vote. But I certainly talk to students about things like forgiving college debt. I tell students, they have a vested interest in knowing about that. They may have a vested interest in voting for that. So I think the whole idea of what counts as political and what counts as partisan is where teachers need to be thinking. And that's slightly different than how we teach students. And I do think that's a kind of we're being forced to think about that.
Yeah, it's all about the positioning of ourselves and those ethical selves that we bring to the classroom, which is another section of this book that you and I have, worked on together. So Paul, thank you so much for taking the time. I put in the chat the link to Paul's blog. I encourage everybody to check it out. There's all kinds of honest and political writing on there, not necessarily partisan, but Paul makes me think all the time about my stance as a teacher. So thank you again, Paul, and thanks everybody for coming tonight, and I will see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.